People are, good morning. People are just rolling in right now. We'll take 1 second to let people get into the session. My name's Lisa Butler. I'm going to be your moderator today. And we're going to be talking about what would Elvis do? This is the curious case of the Memphis sand aquifer. And I think we're looking like people are just about all rolled in at this point. So I'll go ahead and move into the program. So our speaker today is going to be Michael Campana, the professor of hydrogeology and water resources management at Oregon State University. Michael, for those of you who are regular attenders, know that he's our regular moderator. I'm filling in today because he's our speaker. He's also a past president of the American Water Resources Association and has a list of other water credentials that are far too long to include in this particular introduction. But all of us that know him, love him, and we're thrilled to hear his presentation today. The American Water Resources Association has 3 important goals. We want to build community, have conversations, and create connections. So we're really excited that you're able to join us today. We'd like you to be engaged today. There's ways to participate. We want you to chat with us, ask us questions. Michael really enjoys the questions, so please put things down. You don't have to wait. You can just start typing in even as he's speaking. If you're having audio challenges, you can switch over to your telephone. Just click on the arrow that you have some different choices and that'll allow you to move over. Later on, you're going to be getting an email with the webinar recording that you can keep for later, as well as information about getting your PDH certificate. So we also will be including the slides. These slides that he's going to be sharing today are really quite informative. So this is me again. You can see me. This was my pre-COVID hair. I think we were all sporting a little bit more length than we were previously. I'm also a past president of AWRA, and my current position, I'm an executive facilitator at Stantec here in Sacramento. Michael, of course, is up in Oregon, and he's our regular series moderator, and thrilled to have him be a speaker today. So we'd like you to know a little bit more about what's going to be going on at the American Water Resources Association. We have an annual conference coming up in Florida. This particular location is pretty close to Disney World. I know we're all watching with bated breath about what's going on with COVID, and we'll certainly be mindful of that. Right now, we're planning to have the ability to have some people pipe in, mostly an in-person conference though. So we'll keep you posted though if anything changes. We are looking forward to being in Austin in March of the spring of next year, the Geospatial Water Technology Conference. If you're into any of this type of work, this is the best conference to go to ever. The people are amazing. The presentations are amazing. Very excited. And being in Austin in the spring will be lovely. Also, we'll be in Alabama. They're doing a spring specialty conference on water risk under a rapidly changing world. And later on, we've already scheduled for next month. Our September webinar is going to be Virginia State Water Resources Planning Process. It's the statewide cumulative impact modeling of future local water demands, which that should be quite an interesting presentation. And that actually will include our current president of the American Water Resources Association will be one of the speakers. If you have ideas for webinars, please let us know. We're building out our schedule. We do have something on tap for November, but we do have some other openings. So please give us a holler. You can send a note to any of us and we'll be happy to take that into account. So with that, thank you so much for joining us. I'm looking forward to hearing the presentation and then also looking at all of your questions. So with that, Michael, please take it away.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Let me click on the, I trust you can hear my voice and see the screen, but that's actually the last slide.
It's so looking good.
You shouldn't have seen that. Now
Yes.
Everything's gone. So
it's a spoiler alert.
I know. Spoiler alert. Okay.
Spoiler alert.
Okay. Someone asked me why I titled it this way. Just for the heck of it, I don't think Elvis, of course, died many years ago. I'm not sure if he were alive, he'd do very much. But the reason I put that in, of course, is because Elvis, although not a native of Memphis, his mansion Graceland is located there. He himself was born in Mississippi, Northeast Mississippi, in Tupelo. So he's got connections to both areas. So he might have a hard time figuring out what to do. So one thing about my PowerPoints, I've been criticized a lot for them, and that's fine. But the reason they're so busy and I have a lot of URLs on them is because I post all my PowerPoints. And in fact, this one is already on my Wednesday blog. So if you go to waterwire.org, you can already see what I'm going to be presenting, and you can just jump ahead and quit. So anyway, so let's get going. This is an interesting case. I'm not a water lawyer, and some would argue I have no business presenting this kind of material, but you get a different perspective. And I hang around with some really smart water lawyers like Gabriel Eckstein and Lara Fowler and Bob Cassis and a number of others that I won't mention. So I've picked up a little bit. So this is a list of things I'm going to discuss. And the very last topic, that pipeline dreams, that's kind of a bonus topic. It's about something that's going on now in the Memphis area. It's not necessarily related to the lawsuit with Mississippi, but I thought I've got a couple slides talking about that. So anyway, first thing is, why am I doing this? Since I'm not from that area, I grew up in New York City. I did go to school in Virginia, but that's quite a ways away from Memphis. So how did I get sucked into this? And I've been following this case for just about 15 years, since it started in the early 2000s. And it all started when Tom Charlier, who at the time was a reporter for the Memphis Commercial Appeal, called me up in, I think it was the summer of 2007, and asked if I'd heard about this lawsuit between Mississippi and Tennessee. And I mentioned that I'd heard about it, but I wasn't all that familiar with it. So he wanted to interview me. So I said, give me a couple days to catch up and then we'll talk. So we had a nice interview. He wrote a little article in the Commercial Appeal. And then about 3 or 4 weeks later, someone from Mississippi Public Radio contacted me and did an on-the-air interview. And of course, the reason they were calling me is not because I have any great knowledge of the area, but the local experts were reluctant to talk, because they were afraid, if they had consulting contracts with the city of Memphis or Memphis Light, Gas and Water or the state of Mississippi or something, it could jeopardize their work. So they were, didn't want to talk. So they started, the media people started calling people out of town, and that included attorneys too, like Noah Hall, whom I'll mention a little bit later. And it struck me that this story was really a Western water story, because it was strictly a water quantity issue. No water quality, no navigation issues, anything like that. It was water quality, plain and simple. And to me, the irony was that you've got two states in one of the US's wettest regions. The average annual precip in this area is around 50 inches, okay? I know some of you are rolling your eyes now and saying, gosh, why don't you send some out here? And they're also adjacent to one of the world's largest rivers. The Mississippi River, for those of you who aren't too familiar with it, we have the Columbia up here in the Northwest, which is a huge river. Well, the Mississippi's average annual flow is more than double that of the Columbia. Okay, so it's, I think it's number 19 or 20 in the world in terms of discharge. And so there they are arguing about not surface water, but they're arguing about groundwater in this case. And they're also very important national and international implications. The national ones I knew, but the international ones, I got to thank Gabriel Eckstein for cluing me in on why this case would have international implications. So we'll get to that. Here we are, the great state of Tennessee. Memphis is way down in the southwestern corner there in Shelby County. As mentioned, it's on the banks of the Mississippi River. It is the second largest city and metropolitan area in Tennessee. Nashville, the capital, just up to the northeast there is the largest. And Memphis itself has about 700,000 people, and the metro area is probably 1.2 or 1.3 million or something. So it's a fairly good sized city. It's the headquarters for Federal Express. So there you can, that's a little bit of trivia you might want to know. So we're way down there in the southwest corner, and right below it is Mississippi, and right across the river is the state of Arkansas. Okay, so there you go. So a little bit of background. Memphis has a city-owned utility, Memphis Light, Gas, and Water, MLGW. It provides water as well as the other utilities to a little over 1 million people. They started pumping groundwater around 1924, so it's been almost 100 years. And actually, there have been wells drilled in this area since right around starting around the Civil War time. So people have been drilling wells here. The water quality, if you go, is very good. And Memphis Light, Gas, and Water claims, as everybody likes to claim something special, they're the largest city-owned utility in the US that provides all three critical utilities: water, gas, and electricity. They buy electricity from the TVA, they don't generate their own, and they buy gas from a company, but water, they pump themselves. It's all groundwater, and it's all from a formation called the Memphis Sand, which in keeping with geo-confusion is also known as the Sparta Sand or the Middle Claiborne Aquifer, blah, blah, blah. The daily pumpage is quite large, 160 to about 200 million gallons per day. I've also got it in acre feet there. And Alan Cameron, who was an attorney for the first go around of this lawsuit, claims that Memphis is the world's largest city that relies solely on groundwater. Now that's a tall order, because Memphis is, like I said, only about 700,000 people. And San Antonio used to be the largest city that relied solely on groundwater. And San Antonio is double the size of Memphis, but it no longer relies solely on groundwater. So that's the catch. It pumps more water, groundwater, than Memphis, but it now gets a little bit of surface water. So sorry about that, San Antonio. Mississippi, Memphis has passed you. So Memphis Sand, this is a formation of sand and gravel. Very productive aquifer, as are a number of other formations in this particular part of the country. The Memphis Sand underlies Arkansas, Tennessee, Mississippi, and a little bit of Kentucky. It can be up to 900 feet thick. It's a very coarse sand, which means that water flows through it very well. It has interbedded lenses of clay and silt. And so this aquifer has very good storage and transmissive properties. And those are the two properties that you look for in a good aquifer, that you can store a lot of water and it flows through pretty easily. The chemical quality is very, very good, very low total dissolved solids. So MLGW doesn't have to do much in ways of purifying the water. Of course, they do disinfect it. You can see precipitation there is pretty high, and there's plenty of recharge going into the Memphis Sand. We'll show some pictures a little bit later. And up to 20% of precipitation is recharge. Okay, so that's like 10 inches of recharge per year. And again, for those of us in the West, although not here in Corvallis, the whole state doesn't even get 10 inches of rain or something like that. I mean, remember in Albuquerque, 12 inches of rain, that was it. Now, the total amount of water contained in the Memphis Sand is rumored to be huge. 380 cubic kilometers is one estimate. And you're probably saying, well, what the heck is a cubic kilometer? It's a lot of water. Okay, 1 cubic kilometer is 811,000 acre feet. Okay, but that number is approximately 35% of the global annual groundwater pumping. And I said global, the entire world, or 80% of Lake Erie's volume. And we all know that we really don't want to drink Lake Erie's water, but it does hold a lot of water. Okay. Now, I'm looking at those numbers, and I know some people will misinterpret that and say, my gosh, Memphis pumps as much water as 35% pumped globally. No, we're talking now about the storage of water that's actually stored in the aquifer. And it's important to realize that all that water, that 380 cubic kilometers or whatever a better number is, that not all that is recoverable. Groundwater is like pumping out oil and gas. You can't get it all out of the ground. Some of it stays in. So some of it's going to be around for a while. So anyway, a lot of water. This is a cross section of what the Memphis sand looks like and some other formations beneath the surface. Now, for those of you who aren't geologists, this is known as this is a vertical cross section. And you can see this is like a slice of a layer cake. If you went into the Memphis area with the huge cake knife and you cut it down to 3,500 feet, you can see on the left-hand side, and pulled one side away, this is what the rocks would look like, okay, the layers. And the thing to remember, though, is that the horizontal distance is much greater than the vertical distance. And this is known as vertical exaggeration. And you can see that this cross section, the total length along the bottom is about 150 miles, but the depth is only 3,500 feet. So what that means is that the dip or the slope of those rock layers that we see are greatly exaggerated. The slope or the dip is more like 1% as opposed to about 30% that you're looking at now. And this is known as vertical exaggeration. And if you're a geologist or an engineer, you're familiar with this. And so you know that you're not getting a true picture of what things look like underground. And if you drew this entirely to scale, what would happen is that for the representation of the rocks, you'd have just a straight line across the top of the page. You couldn't see any kind of detail. And I'll take a little aside here. For those of you who read the book, A Civil Action, and maybe even saw the movie starring John Travolta, that was about a legal case involving groundwater contamination in the Boston area. And in one of the scenes, I don't know this was in the movie, but it was in the book, the consultants for, I forget, I think it was for the plaintiffs, they presented a vertical cross section to the judge because this was not a jury trial, I don't think. And the judge, of course, was not a geologist and he didn't know about vertical exaggeration. So when the other lawyer brought this up, that this is vertically exaggerated, the judge became incensed because he thought he was being tricked. So he demanded that this thing be done to scale, which the consultants did, and it was wrapped around the courtroom several times. So you might want to read that book. It's a good book anyway. Now, here's another interesting cross section, okay? This is actually a beer that's produced in the Memphis area called Memphis Sands. And you'll notice that the artwork on the can looks very much like the rocks we just passed up. So this is, since I'm not a beer aficionado, I can't attest to the quality, but my former student, Courtney Van Stoke, who grew up in the area, says she said it tastes pretty good. So, and as one wag mentioned, with this kind of thing on Tennessee's side, probably one Supreme Court justice will come down in favor of Tennessee's case. So anyway, here's another cross section. This one is a little easier to see because it's three-dimensional, or it depicts three dimensions. And the Sparta-Memphis Aquifer, that's the rock body that we're interested in. You can see that those blue arrows, that's the recharge that's seeping in from the surface from precipitation and maybe the occasional snowfall they get in this area that seeps down into the aquifer and replenishes the aquifer. And so this is another reason why people like to use groundwater from these formations because there's a good degree of replenishment. And you can see the Mississippi River actually flowing up there to the actually to the northeast here. Memphis is right there in the corner, and then Mississippi on the other side. So anyway, so what was the big deal? What were people concerned with here? Okay. Memphis Light Gas and Water pumps from what are called well fields. Usually when you locate wells, they're located in clusters because the aquifer properties can vary from place to place. And one part of the aquifer may yield really good amount of water and another not so good. And are also land availability issues. The utility may not be able to purchase the land to put the wells on or whatever. So we'll show a picture of well fields. They have about 175 wells. I think there are a few more now. And so they pump the water for their customers. And some of that water is drawn from the state of Mississippi. And so Mississippi claimed, this was in the early 2000s, maybe late 20th century, that Memphis Light Gas and Water, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of the city of Memphis, is stealing its groundwater. And they claimed at this time in the early 2000s that it was 70 acre feet per day. And in the 40-year period from 1965 to 2005, they took 1.1 million acre feet away. And in fact, at one time, Mississippi listed Memphis as the biggest user of its groundwater on there. I think it was the Department of Environmental Quality or whatever, whoever manages the water there. They listed Memphis as the largest user of its groundwater. And so this is a diagram, this is a map here of that I think Alan Cameron prepared. And the kind of the beige color, that's the outline of the city of Memphis. The yellow that you see behind that, I know the colors, the contrast really isn't that good. That represents the extent of the pumping, the aerial extent. And then the black dots are the well fields that the city of Memphis operates. And the larger the circle, that's directly proportional to how much water is pumped. So you've got several, you've got a large one right on the state line. So obviously that's going to be pulling some groundwater from Tennessee. And then the other ones are taking it from other parts of Tennessee as well. I meant to say Mississippi is losing some of its water to Tennessee. So no one, I don't think, really disputed this, maybe the amount, but most people know that when you pump groundwater, you draw water from places, say, that are outside the land that you own. For example, here in Oregon, if you go down to the Oregon-California line in the south, the area where they had the big bootleg fire, or have the big bootleg fire, just south of the state line of Oregon. And when I say just south, I mean really just south, like, you could probably almost reach out and touch them, I think. There's some large wells that some California farmers use, and they pump a lot of water, okay? It's not like we don't know this in Oregon. And I know on occasions, probably recently, our state water people asked the California people, could you get these guys to maybe cut back a little bit? And in the instances I'm aware of, they did. I mean, no lawsuits or anything like that. So anyway, this is a little bit more of hydrogeology here. This is what it looks like when you pump water. Okay, you get what's called a cone of depression. The water level is depressed, okay, because you're sucking water out of the ground, and it's got that conical shape. This is a diagram. This is a busy diagram, again, by Cameron, of the same area we showed a couple slides ago. That pinkish area, that's the city of Memphis outline. And you'll see a whole bunch of lines here, red lines, dark lines, and you're saying, my gosh, this is a very busy, confusing map. And what Cameron was trying to show here was that this is similar to a topographic map. I think you're all familiar with topo maps, topo sheets, USGS 1 to 12,000. You see a bunch of lines on there that have numbers on them. Those numbers represent elevations above mean sea level for the topographic maps. And so you can look at a flat piece of paper, and from the arrangement of the topographic lines, you can say whether it's steep, whether there's a peak there, where there's a depression or whatever. And the same thing is true of groundwater levels. If you measure the water levels in the aquifer, you can then, and you do that using wells, you can plot these up on paper like this, and you can show which way the groundwater is moving. And the groundwater moves from where the numbers on the lines are high to where they're lower, just like topography. Things roll downhill from where the contour lines have high numbers to where they have lower numbers. And if you draw lines here, like those red arrow lines at the bottom, you can depict which way the water is moving. And you can see that Cameron picked this so that the water is flowing to several well fields. One is right on the Mississippi, Tennessee state line. So it looks pretty bad for Mississippi. Now, one thing you have to remember is Cameron does not show the pumping that Mississippi is doing in DeSoto County, which is just south of Memphis. So it looks like Memphis is the only one doing water pumping, groundwater pumping in this area, and that's not true. Okay, this is my favorite diagram in this whole series here. This is a nice kind of a three-dimensional type diagram. And again, this is from Alan Cameron, and it shows the cones of depression, if you will. And I love it because they're colored black. You see 3 black dots there. And I can just imagine what Cameron is saying to the judge, like, Judge, you know what a black hole is. Everybody knows what a black hole is. It's something up there in the sky that sucks things in and never gives anything up. And so you could say, and this is what Tennessee is doing to poor Mississippi. They're sucking water into those black holes of wells, and it's not coming back, and Mississippi is suffering greatly. Okay. So I think that was very, very appropriate that he did it that way. I wouldn't have had the foresight or intelligence to do that. I would have made some other color probably. Now, state groundwater allocation laws. Now, you knew this was coming, okay? We're about halfway through with this talk, more than halfway. Okay, and this, I have to thank my friend Ken Rainwater at Texas Tech University. He's a professor there, a civil engineer. And I always have to mention it, that's about the best last name in the world for a hydrologist is Rainwater. And Ken had one of his students put together this this table, and the 3 states that I've put in red there and emboldened are the 3 states that sit on top of the Memphis sand aquifer and extract water from it: Mississippi, Tennessee, and Arkansas. Now, Arkansas was not involved in this. Okay, they didn't participate in the lawsuit. But you look at the ownership of the water in Mississippi, the state owns the groundwater. Okay, they own the groundwater, and they claim, and this is probably true, that they're holding it in public trust for the citizens of the state for their use. They don't want anybody else to use it. Tennessee, on the other hand, the landowner owns or has use of the water beneath his or her land. And there is this is like Texas, okay, except unlike Texas, Tennessee has a reasonable use provision. So you can pump the water under your land, but if you use it unreasonably, then you can get your hand slapped or your pump turned off. Now, we're not going to argue about, well, what do you mean by reasonable? Okay. But Tennessee and Mississippi have 2 very different laws. Okay. So, and here's some links here for you can look at these. So the plot thickens, as I say, because Mississippi groundwater flowed into Tennessee before Mississippi's groundwater is pumping. And so this is refuting the argument that Tennessee is stealing the groundwater. This was naturally flowing. And in fact, a couple of people, Brian Waldron and Dan Larson of the University of Memphis, showed that Mississippi may have stolen 30 acre feet of Tennessee's water because of their pumping in DeSoto County. Okay, and this was actually published in AWRA, our journal, about 7 years ago. So they're saying, okay, wait a minute, Mississippi, you're taking some of our water. So that didn't matter. Mississippi filed a lawsuit against Memphis and its utility in 2006. And at the time, the three states were discussing aquifer water allocation and management. Mississippi withdrew from the talks, and then in 2006, a year after it withdrew, it filed a lawsuit. They filed a lawsuit in federal district court, first at the district that was based in Oxford, Mississippi. They lost there. They went to the federal appeals court in New Orleans, and they lost there. Now, they then decided to go to the Supreme Court, which they have that option to do. The Supreme Court, US Supreme Court, declined to hear it, but they dismissed it or declined to hear it without prejudice, which means that Mississippi could refile if evidence warranted it. Now, the interesting thing is that the two lower courts, the federal court in Oxford and the appeals court in New Orleans, told Mississippi that you must sue Tennessee because Tennessee is on top of the heap when it comes to allocating water in Tennessee, because Memphis is a political subdivision of Tennessee. MLGW is a political subdivision of Memphis. So Tennessee is holding all the cards here. So you got to sue Tennessee because they allocate the water. So what happened was that Mississippi went home, and it looked like Tennessee was in charge now. They could keep pumping the water. Well, in early 2016, Mississippi went back to court, and they sued Tennessee as well as Memphis and MLGW. And they took it, since it was a state versus state original jurisdiction, it went right to the Supreme Court. Except this time they cut the damages in half. They wanted 615 million instead of, I think it was 1.1 or 1.3 in the original case. And the Supreme Court accepted the case. Okay. Now, hearsay is, I heard this from a few attorney friends, is that the Supreme Court was advised not to accept this was between two states. They could handle this themselves, let them work it out. And for whatever reason, I'm not privy to, they said, no, we're going to hear it. And this is the only groundwater only case that has appeared and been accepted by the Supreme Court. Okay, so this is why, one reason this is a really important case. It's going to be a precedent, likely. Okay, this has never been done before. We know that states have sued each other over surface water. I mean, look at my former home state of New Mexico and Texas. It seems like every week they sue each other. Okay, Texas always wins. Okay, so it's going to the Supreme Court. So does the Supreme Court, tell the people to come in and we'll have a trial? No, the Supreme Court is an appellate court for the most part, but they can operate like a trial court. And so what they do is they appoint someone called a special master, and that special master is often a retired federal judge. And the special master essentially acts as a trial judge. I put that in quotes. And conducts the fact finding and narrows the case and all this other kind of stuff. And so they asked the Honorable Eugene E. Seiler Jr. of Kentucky to be the special master. So he's going to take the case, and then he will make a recommendation to the Supreme Court. They will then decide what they're going to do about it, and they'll give the plaintiff and the defendant 30 minutes each to pitch the case before the Supreme Court. So, case sat around for a while. These are just some of my takes here, and you can take these for what these are worth. The Snake Valley case, okay, and that website will take you to the paper there about Utah and Nevada going over allocating Snake Valley groundwater. Not a compact, just an agreement, but Gary Herbert decided not to sign it. The states could also develop a compact. There is no compact that covers groundwater only in the United States. We have about 30 compacts. that cover or that deal with water, that deal with allocation of water. They deal with quality of water, like the one on the Ohio River and a few other things. So you could do something like that, okay? And in fact, Holly Mondo's thesis there, and if you, that's her URL for the thesis, actually wrote a thesis on how the states might go about doing this and what it might look like. So anyway, that's something else. My feeling is that I'm not enthused about a Mississippi victory, because I think that could lead to more conflict. And that last thing that I put in there, John Wells, who's I'm not sure, I don't know if John's on this webinar.
John is on the webinar and he's already got some questions to me, Michael.
I know he does, but we'll be here till 1:30 if we not 1:30 Pacific time. No, John, I love you, and I put what you said in at a previous talk about the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution, which, as some of you may know, the Commerce Clause gives Congress the right to regulate interstate articles of commerce. And water, I believe, has been shown to be an article of commerce. So John's question to me was, and I think I avoided it at the time, John, is why don't they just apply the Commerce Clause? And I'm sure there's some lawyers out there. I know there's some lawyers on the call. They're probably waiting to take my head off, or John's head, but not mine. Anyway, so those are my just my takes. I would not be enthused about a Mississippi victory. And Noah Hall, whom some of you know, I don't think Noah's on the call. He's a professor at Wayne State. He runs the Great Lakes Law Blog, an excellent place to find information about the Great Lakes. Noah and I did a tag team webinar a couple of years ago before an association of state legislators. I did the hydrogeology, he did the law stuff, and this was one of the things that he mentioned. He feels very strongly, and he was not involved in the case, that that the whole thing is about money, that Mississippi wants money, and the Supreme Court should not have messed with it. And if you go to that URL, you can see his presentation as well. Now, here's an update. Hey, we're getting close to the present, March 2020. Okay, their final arguments were presented before Judge Seiler in February and March 2020. You can find them there. The special master will render a decision in form. SCOTUS will have the final say, and the last words, but I have that in a question mark, came out last November. Judge Seiler recommended that the groundwater in question is an interstate, not intrastate resource, which Mississippi was arguing. They argued that the what they call the Sparta Aquifer was entirely within Mississippi, so it's Mississippi's water. But of course, Seiler pointed out, well, how can you say that? Because you're claiming that water is moving into Tennessee, which means that it's not an intrastate aquifer, it's interstate. So you can't have it both ways. So he dismissed Mississippi's case, or he's going to recommend that it be dismissed and that equitable apportionment be implemented to split the water up in the aquifer. Now, and that link you see at the bottom from Jesse Richardson's comments, if you go to that link, you can actually you can download a copy of Judge Seiler's recommendation. And he goes into equitable apportionment and what it is in great detail there. And that blog, that link takes you to one of my blogs where Jesse Richardson, I know some of you know Jesse, he's a water lawyer at and land lawyer at West Virginia University School of Law. And I asked him to write a piece on Seiler's recommendation, and that's where that link is. And you can also get Seiler's, his write-up is only about 25 pages or so. And this is the conclusion here. And he starts out by saying, water is finite, especially the usable kind. I love that. A couple journalists misread that first sentence, and they said that, oh, Judge Seiler said that water was infinite. And I just think they saw the is, and they thought that was IN and something like that. Anyway, no, he did not say that. He said it's finite. That's what he recommended. So that's Judge Seiler. But as the person said years ago, the opera isn't over till a fat lady sings. And the fat lady in this case is, and I don't mean to disparage anybody on the court, is the Supreme Court. They're the ones that do the singing at the end, so they have the final say. A number of people thought they might get to it in the term that just ended, in the month of June, but they didn't. And so hopefully it'll come up in the upcoming term, which begins around October. And what'll happen is that each side will get 30 minutes to present its case, and the court will get questions, and they'll decide. I'm coming down on the side of still on the side of Tennessee, and if some of you, we should be able to listen to this. I know I listened to the ACF hearing with Florida and Georgia, and that was fascinating. I'd never heard that before. But the attorneys for each side get presentation, and the questions that were asked by each and every justice, some of them were really right on the mark. I mean, they had done their homework. So I'm really hoping I can hear this and see what goes on. So these are just some other information, some interviews. Before I put this, I did this webinar, I went through, and I see it's 15 minutes before the witching hour. I went through all the URLs and checked them. And so some of them I had to remove. That article by Chris Bennett in the Farm Journal is a really good one, but the link was broken and I couldn't find the new one. But those other ones are. Next thing is, why is this important? Why are we going on about this stuff? Boom, right here. These are principal aquifers in the United States. Okay, how many? And remember, we're talking about transboundary aquifers here. And you may say, wait a minute, transboundary is between countries. No, it's between different political jurisdictions. And if you look at the map here, you see a bunch of transboundary aquifers. And right in the middle, in that light blue, the one that looks like a Rorschach's test, you see the High Plains Aquifer, also known as the Ogallala Aquifer. And that underlies parts of 8 states and actually almost all of Nebraska. And can you see some litigation going on over that? Okay, about, Kansas is saying that, hey, Nebraska is taking too much water, or, Texas saying New Mexico. It's another fight for Texas and New Mexico. Okay, we can fight over the High Plains Aquifer down there. There's some fights going on, I don't want to say fights, but some disagreements going on about using aquifer pore space. Okay, I mean, you can argue over the water, but what about the openings in the aquifer? Who owns those things? Now, whether or not, that in this case, I don't believe this was brought up at all, but there's a case between an Indian tribe in Southern California and one of the water districts. I think it's the Coachella Valley Water District, about invading the space beneath the reservation and using the pore space to store aquifer recharge, and you didn't rent this pore space. I mean, you may say, well, come on, this is silly. No, it's not. It's going to happen. So to me, and I've talked to some water lawyer friends, that if Mississippi wins, this could open up litigation at some of these transboundary aquifers. I know that Indiana has a part of a state agency that deals with interstate aquifers. From there's the so-called Mission-Do aquifer, which is Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio. Indiana shares aquifer with Kentucky. So they've got their eyes on things. So who knows? Okay. Here we go. This is from Rosaria Sanchez and Victoria Lopez and Gabriel Eckstein. This article, these are transboundary aquifers on the southern border. Okay. Now you may say, well, Mexico has different water laws. This could mean some, have some effect down here. Let's go up north. We forget about north. We've already had a disagreement over the Abbotsford Aquifer, which is Sumas Abbotsford Aquifer, which is BC and Washington. And that actually didn't involve any court cases. And actually the two federal governments stepped back and the locals handled the problem, and the province and the states. This was actually kind of a neat case. Now, I mention this because there are some aquifers in the prairie provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, that some of them are contained within the provinces and don't border on the United States, and they have interprovincial issues. And in fact, they have an organization that actually that looks at those and resolves any difficulties. So they may be looking at this case to see, well, how does this apply to our cases? And also, how does it apply to look at that big white blob down there with some of the cases we have, or some of the shared aquifers we have with the United States? And there are also some way over here where I'm going to be next week up in Vermont and New Hampshire. So maybe I can go check those things out. So anyway, so that's where we are. And so this to me is a fascinating problem. And I'm really curious to see when the judgment finally comes down. And again, I'd be willing, I'm not a betting man, but I think Mississippi is not going to win, to see what'll happen. And the reason goes beyond North America, which I just showed, is that there are people in other countries who look to the Supreme Court for leadership. And so they're curious to see, and I know Gabriel Eckstein, and he's the one who mentioned this to me, and he knows some of these people, they're curious to see how this is going to come down and what it might mean for their aquifer systems. So anyway, I just wanted to close with very quickly now, what they're doing in Memphis, in the Shelby County, Memphis area, is they formed an organization called Protect Our Aquifer. If you go to protectouraquifer.org, that's the website. It's a nonprofit 501c3 founded in 2017. In late May, I think, they just hired their first full-time executive director, Sarah Houston, who came over from the University of Memphis. And they're developing a 5-year strategic plan. There was a brouhaha over the Byhalia pipeline, which was an oil pipeline that was supposed to run through Memphis. That, I found out before I prepared this, had just been canceled. But the POA is interested in regulation of pipelines that could further threaten drinking water by breaking and leaking and getting into the Memphis aquifer. They're, I think, pursuing a $5 million project from MLGW using the great talent they have at the University of Memphis. There are also environmental justice issues related to water and oil and a whole bunch of things. So POA has really expanded its horizon. So I urge you to go look on their website and see what they're tuning into. This is just the current pipelines in the area. This top pipeline is the Collierville pipeline, and the lower pipeline, which actually goes through a lot of Mississippi before coming back up into the Valero refinery up in the northwest corner of this diagram. That's where the proposed Byhalia pipeline was going to be located, but that's been put on the table for now. There's some places that you can't see too well here that are what I call windows or breaches in the sediments overlying the Memphis sand, which could form avenues of contamination. And that's what this next diagram shows from Kostler, who was a consultant for the organization, showing how the shallow aquifer and the upper Claiborne confining unit, there could be breaks in the formations, and anything leaking from the pipeline up top could get down into the Memphis aquifer and contaminate the well. So that's one thing that POA is actively working on, is making sure that the great water that they get from the Memphis sand stays great, not just from leaking oil pipelines and things like that, but spills at gas stations and whatever that you have. And again, there are also justice issues. This is references or a bunch of a bibliography that I put together some of the links don't work anymore. Well, I had took them out, but the links that are still in there work really good. There's Holly Mondo's dissertation, Christine Klein's article. She's a law professor at the University of Florida. Really nice woman. I worked on a committee with her. This is a really good example. I encourage you to read it. It's very readable. There's Noah Hall, and then the article by Sanchez Lopez and Eckstein is good. Alfonso Rivera. So anyway, some references, and here's what I started out with. These are, this is a diagram. This is a live photo actually of Mississippi and Tennessee representatives discussing water allocation without their lawyers. Now, don't worry about the mountains in the background. They've had some uplifts there in Western Tennessee, and so they kind of cropped up. But this is the way that discussing water problems out west. That's the caption for that particular article. You can get it at duckboy.com. So thank you very much. I've gone through this very quickly. Again, this is already online. So if you want to go back and check those links, you don't have to wait until you get this or a link to it from AWRA. So Ms. Butler, I ran
Thank you.
8 minutes over, but for me,
No,
that's good. That's good.
This is wonderful. Absolutely wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. We do have some questions, so I'm going to go ahead and jump in. And it goes back. I've been encouraging people to write things down as we're going along. So you made a comment pretty early in the webinar about the fact that this is going to be the first groundwater case only that went to the Supreme Court. So one of the questions was about Sport Chase versus the state of Nebraska. And I'm just wondering, was that also a groundwater case or was it a mixed case? Does that ring a bell?
It was a groundwater case, but Spore Hayes, it wasn't Colorado versus Nebraska. It was an individual versus Nebraska.
Ah, okay.
It was about pumping water from one state, and then because the Spore Hayes's farm straddled Colorado, Nebraska. I mean, that came close, but it wasn't Colorado suing Nebraska or vice versa.
Okay, so it's kind of that qualifier around the states being in the discussion. Okay, so there was a question about the actual aquifer. Is there a connection of the aquifer to the Mississippi or other important surface waters that are somehow playing into this?
I doubt it, because the Memphis sand goes under the Mississippi River, and I suspect there's leakage. I mean, there's communication between the Mississippi and their surrounding sediments. I don't know if that extends to the Memphis sand, though.
Okay.
But,
one person was wondering why they didn't try to come up with some more collaborative kinds of solutions. For example, this person's from Delaware, and she's saying, why don't we do something like we've done up here for the Delaware Bay with the river and the Bay Commission, having joint representatives, maybe a federal appointee. So do you have any thoughts on how they approach this?
I honestly don't know. I came into this after the agreement. I mean, as I mentioned, the 3 states were talking about it, and then Mississippi pulled out. So at one point they were trying to come to an agreement, and but as you know, the young woman the young person from Delaware, I mean, that's a good idea, but not all negotiations work out, and this was a case where it didn't. And my student Holly Mondo in her thesis kind of worked on this. In fact, she is doing a project in Eastern Oregon dealing with but that's like an internal. It's not like between Washington and Idaho. Mm-hmm. But it's too bad it didn't. I don't know why. Maybe they didn't have good facilitators. You know, Lisa, you should go there and slap them around a bit. But yeah, no, that's a good question. I think what'll happen is now they're going to be forced to go back because Judge Seiler said, no, you guys got to get together, and I suspect the Supreme Court will uphold him. So. Yeah. Yeah.
It was interesting because the person who made the observation was, kind of augmenting that by saying that the commission is really operating separate from the states. So there's sort of a layering there. that creates a different dynamic, and they determine their own rules and
Well,
regulations.
yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, that's what I would hope, that if they have that they are, each state picks or whatever, commissioners and things like that. And then but they go about it their own way. I mean, I'm familiar with the DRBC, Delaware River Basin Commission, and, our mutual friend Carol Collier used to run that place.
Mhm.
And, I mean, states would put pressure on them, but they were independent.
Yeah. Now here's another interesting observation about the case itself. So right now the conversations about the Mississippi and Memphis, but there are also causes of depression in Louisiana where the aquifer extends. And really, how far and wide should this conversation be? Is this actually legitimately?
That's a good question, because this whole thing is part of an area called the Mississippi embayment. Okay, which they have very productive aquifers, as the person said, down going down to East Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, all kinds. So that's really kind of interesting. I mean, you could form a regional. I mean, when I say regional, I mean like, Mid-South. So it depends upon, who knows, someone from I don't know that I doubt that the pumping effects from the Memphis area extend down into Louisiana to any great degree, but I've been wrong before. That's a very good question. They should have a regional meeting and get together and say, hey, let's do something.
Well, and that would really speak to some of what the other questioner was asking about, the idea of what an actual governance structure should look like. Should it be a state to state conversation? So that's very additive. Also, just a note from Sarah Houston. She says, thanks for the shout out. We're coming in at the right time and appreciate this educational session.
Yeah.
Okay, so Steve Burgess has some great questions as always. One of his questions has to do, the flow net assumes that spatial average hydraulic conductivity is isotropic. Is that the case?
Well, I'm sure it is. I don't know Steve, that's a good question. I don't know the particular model that was used. I assume it was mod flow, and they do have a lot of information on the permeabilities and the hydraulic conductivities, and the geologists certainly know it's not, homogeneous and isotropic, but I don't know the details behind Cameron's model. I do know, though, that bad enough that he neglected the pumping that was going on in Mississippi. So, but you're right. They should,
Yeah. So another question had to do with the natural aquifer flow from Tennessee to Mississippi, and could aquifer well recharge in Tennessee remove the potential adverse gradients and make that argument moot?
You say the potential recharge in Tennessee?
Yeah, that was the question.
Artificial recharge, like, where are they going to get the water from?
So Steve, where are they going to get the water from?
Going to pump it out of the Mississippi? That's interesting, because Mississippi, let's say if Memphis or Tennessee loses this case and the court says you got to cut your pumping in half, they could take that water out of the Mississippi River, which they could do. Okay, I mean, legally they can do it, but the cost of treatment and the rejiggering of the distribution system would be exorbitant. So, they do have another supply. Now they could take water out of the Mississippi River and recharge it, but I'm not sure some people would want to drink it. I mean, I don't know, but that's a good question.
Great, thank you.
I'll give you some names for you to call down there, Steve. It's on Mississippi Public Radio. Yes.
That's great. Okay, I've got time for one more question, so I'm going to go ahead and hit this one here. So this has to do with, and I apparently didn't say it correctly. So it's Sporthays decision or Sportchase decision. Okay. and that's tying the water to interstate commerce.
Yeah, right.
And so this is from Johnny saying the state of Minnesota, but so the state of
Okay.
Minnesota prohibits interstate and interstate water transfers, and it's able to do so because it argues that it needs the water it has for use within the state within the next 50 years, which was what the case was testing. And so he's asking, has either Memphis, Tennessee, or Mississippi defined their water use and projected needs as part of this case?
I don't think so, but I'm not 100% sure. I suspect Mississippi has. I
Mhm.
would be surprised if they hadn't, because they're claiming, look, our water's being stolen. I mean, it was like New Mexico many years ago. They didn't want Texas to take their water, and the court said to them, well, do you know how much you have and how much you need to use? And they kind of said, well, no. And that led to a state water plan. So I don't know. It's a good question. I would hope so, but
Yeah,
I don't
that's
know.
great. Well, Michael, thank you again. This was so interesting, and I love the way that you were able to weave the story back to all of us and the projects
Well,
that we're working on and the states that we're working in. It's just so helpful to think about it in these terms. We've hit that important witching hour when people need to move to their next appointment. Thank you, everyone, for joining us,
right.
and we greatly appreciate you. We look forward to seeing you at next month's session, which again is going to be about some of the work being done in Virginia, and in future webinars after that. So with that, I think we can probably call it a day.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
You.
Thank you so much, everyone. Take care.